So the next one I had was, oh, this was kind of funny. So there was an SBA, the Small Business Association of Nevada's district director, Joseph Amato, was on a live stream kind of giving everybody an update on the lending for the payroll protection program. Basically, if our viewers don't know by now, the payroll protection plan loans are issued through banks as part of the CARES Act, and they are forgivable payroll protection loans. And so you can borrow a portion of what your payroll costs would be, and if you spend it on those kind of costs, then it will be forgiven after a time frame. So there was kind of a land grab that was happening last week because everybody thought they had to have their applications in by Friday, and people were getting really nervous. In fact, I had calls from clients that were kind of freaking out. They needed to get their application in as soon as possible because they thought they were going to run out of money. And a lot of banks were not even accepting applications last week. And so this guy, unfortunately, was receiving the ire of people asking questions and kind of blew up at the whole idea that the banks were holding back, and mentioned that they had gotten bailouts and they got all this free money and now they're slow to lend it. But in fact, I think he was kind of, my personal take on it, I think he was probably misplaced in his anger and ire, and probably was just a frustration moment. The banks themselves probably didn't have the infrastructure available or the ability to correctly administer loan applications for this because it was so brand new and so such a quick turnaround on it, that very few banks had the agility to be able to put this loan application in process within 3 or 4 days of when it was being released, and have all of their ducks in a row and have the lawyers comb over all this stuff to make sure that the loan applications were correct. So, but I'd like your guys' take on it.
Yeah, I definitely had two separate bankers in the last couple of days tell me that they're working 16-hour days to try to keep up on training for this new PPP, for submitting the applications. There's been a bunch of back and forth from even like big payroll providers like ADP had discrepancies in how they perform the calculation. And so there's been reports given with certain numbers, and then they come back and say, okay, we didn't do that right, we're going to fix it. And so I think it's just a very hectic time right now for everybody. And, you know, the bankers are doing the best they can to implement the system. But like you said, with all things changing so quickly and with so many hindrances in normal operations, I think it's just a recipe for a poor implementation, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and the government official you were talking about who was complaining about the bank's responsiveness, I mean, they referenced back to the 2008 crisis, right? And said, you know, they got bailed out back then, but now they're not stepping up to do their part. And I mean, I think there is some of that back and forth finger pointing because the government passed the CARE Act to say that this program would be available, but the details of exactly how we work and what the rules were for the calculations for, you know, you have to define these things. Like, what do you mean? What is average payroll that you're going to multiply by 2.5 in order to come up with your loan base? And then what is actually acceptable in terms of the use of those funds? And there's still things that are unknown and undefined that have been kind of kicked down the road because it was like, well, you can initiate the loan without knowing certain things about how the exact forgiveness will happen later. And so I think that the Treasury was issuing regulations or they were issuing rules and facts and additional guidance on this the day that banks were supposed to be able to open up applications. But that same day, the Treasury was still issuing some guidance. So on that side, you could say, well, I think to AJ's point, you could say, well, hey, you know, the banks are working on it, but the government didn't come through with thorough guidance that allowed them to really step up to the plate. And that's what Chase, for example, said. The largest bank said, hey, look, you know, we need more guidance from the government on how this is supposed to operate before we're going to take the risk of jumping in. I think that the other side of it, though, is you know, when you can both appreciate but also have a bit of cynicism about the bank's position, because, you know, what they're really saying and where they're really sitting on this issue is, if they don't dot all their I's and cross all their T's, they're worried that they'll be holding a portfolio of loans that can't be forgiven because they ultimately don't meet the correct SBA guidelines after they were issued. And so now they have all these loans to people that may not be forgiven, and maybe if they didn't actually adhere to the government standards, the SBA won't even guarantee them. And so the bank then has to work that out with the business. And they're just sitting on a ton of potentially bad debt, right? And so, I mean, that's why the bank, when you look at it, you say, that is why, fundamentally, that's why the banks were taking extra steps and not just jumping in and opening applications immediately without taking extra time and steps to verify things, was because of that risk. And knowing that, then you can reflect back on what this government official is saying in terms of, well, fair point. Maybe that's not, maybe they should take an extra risk because the taxpayer took an extra risk on them back in 2008. And so maybe they should take an extra risk and step up here, even if they don't know all the answers. And even if it does mean that they might be sitting on a portfolio of some debts that don't work out for them, maybe they should be doing that given that they got bailed out previously. And yeah, we can say should, maybe, whatever, but right, of course they're not going to do that if they're not required to. So be it.
Yeah, and I think, banks have to look after their own bottom line as well. They employ people. I think they're probably an easy target to, shake your fist at or raise ire to. But I think, they like you said, they're taking the risk of loaning the funds and then having a dud of a loan sitting on their balance sheet that they can't get repaid because it's either not forgiven, or they have their loan. The person they loaned the amount to isn't able to make the payments back because.
But it's supposed to be guaranteed, right? So if they meet just to be clear on that point of what I'm saying there is that if the loan is considered proper under the regulations in the CARES Act, then they don't have that risk because it's guaranteed. The loan itself is guaranteed by the SBA.
Yes. But
the risk is they could be sitting on a debt that isn't guaranteed if in the aftermath, if in the analysis after the fact, it's determined that they didn't actually meet the criteria because we rushed to set this up and nobody understood the rules properly.
And just to kind of elaborate on that, I mean, I can say that with all of the banks that I've personally worked with so far throughout this process, they've all asked for something that is materially very similar, but definitely there are subtle differences to what they believe is the right workings to prepare for this. And so it just kind of goes to that fear of like, yeah, maybe they won't implement this right because it's not clear what, exactly is needed and what some of the finer points are in the calculation,